Hi everyone, and welcome to this Fantasy Art Friday video. In this video I'm going to be working on a drawing of a Christmas dragon, and I thought this would be a really fun idea. When I worked on the initial sketch, I had the dragon sitting on a rock next to a Christmas tree, but in the end I opted to erase the rock and the Christmas tree, and had the dragon sitting inside a tree. So it's a miniature dragon with a little Santa hat, and there's kind of holly leaves hanging around with some holly berries as well. And then my idea was to have the colours of the dragon matching the leaves and the berries that are hanging, just having it kind of camouflaged inside a tree. So as you can see in this video, I started by working on the outlines, and for those I started by using a Pigma Micron 05, which is 0.45mm. I used it to create all the outer edges, all of the outlines around the outer edges of the dragon to begin with, getting an idea of where I wanted to place some extra shading later on by adding some thicker lines. And then after that, in areas where I required some finer lines, I was using a Copic Multiliner SP 0.03mm, which is extremely fine in comparison to the other pen, but it allowed me to add some really fine details where I needed it. I also decided to add a comic panel to this drawing, as I really love doing. They can really make a character stand out from the page. And in this case I wanted to have the dragon's wing overlapping on the right side. And I actually also decided to erase the bottom part of the comic panel, and in place of that I added the dragon's tail. So in effect the dragon's tail was acting as part of the border of this drawing. I wasn't sure how it was going to look in the end, but I thought it'd be a really fun thing to try. With the outlines completed, next up it was time for the colouring. And for the colouring of this drawing I used Copic Markers, starting off by adding some colouring to the dragon's face. I wanted to begin by adding some really light colours at first, because I wasn't sure on the kind of colours I was going to use throughout the rest of the dragon's body, so I felt like starting off with lighter colours first was probably a better idea, to allow for any colours I was going to add later on. So I started by using a pale cobalt green and Nile green to add the lighter and the darker tones to the dragon's face. I also opted to use pale heath to add some warm tones to the front of the dragon's face as well. For the dragon's eye, I used a mixture of crimson and pure pink, and then I used my Uni-Ball Signo Broad white ink pen to add a little dot of highlight to that. As a lot of you know, I always love adding highlights to the eyes. For the colouring of the spikes on the back of the dragon's head, I decided to use crimson and pure pink, the same colours that I use for the eyes. I also decided to use the crimson marker to add all of the colouring to the Santa hat. And to add the grey colouring to the white part of the Santa hat, to add a bit of texturing to that area, I used a cool grey 3. With the dragon's head coloured, I then used the Nile green marker to add some colouring to the rest of the dragon's body, excluding the dragon's belly. And I kind of layered the colouring to add some shading in areas that needed it, adding some shading around the dragon's legs, underneath the wing and those kind of areas. And to also add some extra dark shading to those areas, I used an ocean green marker. And once I placed that colouring down, I wasn't really happy with how smooth the colouring was looking, and I kind of wanted to add some sort of effect to it. And then I thought maybe this dragon could be like really camouflaged amongst the leaves, and so it'd want to look like the holly leaves that are surrounding it. So I started adding some scales to the dragon's skin with my mechanical pencil, just roughly sketching them at first and just getting an idea of where I wanted to place them. After that I brought out my Copic Multiliner to draw all of those scales over the top of the colouring. And once that had dried, that's when I started adding some real shading with the ocean green marker again, adding shading underneath each scale and kind of layering them on top of each other and creating that effect of all of the scales kind of protruding from the surface. Once I was happy with the amount of shading I'd added with the ocean green marker, I then started adding highlights to each individual scale with my Uni-Ball highlighter pen. I also used a white Prismacolor pencil to add some white outlining around each scale, just to really make them stand out. After that I also brought out my black Prismacolor pencil to add some outlining around each scale and to add some shading underneath each one. This added a lot of texture to the scales, and it really helped to define the shaded areas between the legs, and showed up more definition to those areas, and made them kind of more apparent. I didn't want them to kind of disappear amongst all the texturing and then you couldn't see the legs, so adding some extra shading with the black Prismacolor pencil was very helpful in those areas. After adding the darker colouring to the rest of the dragon's body, I realised that the dragon's face was looking a bit too light in comparison. I'd anticipated this being an issue, so I started using a Nile green marker over the top of that light colouring to kind of bring it more to a level with the rest of the dragon's body. To add the yellow colouring to the dragon's belly, I used buttercup yellow, and to add some darker colouring to the bottom of each segment, I used a yellow ochre. I also opted to use a cool grey 3 to add some shading around the bottom of each segment to kind of make them stand out on top of each other. And I also used the pale heath marker and the highlighter pen to show up some highlighting on the front of the dragon. For the colouring inside the dragon's wing, I decided to use crimson and pure pink, the same as the colours I used for the top of the dragon's head, and I also used a cardinal marker to add some shading. And then before moving on to the next part of the drawing, I added some extra shading around the dragon's body with the cool grey 7 and cool grey 5. For the wood texture of the branch that the dragon's sitting on, I started adding the first layer of colouring with the champagne marker, adding some streaks of colour to really show up the different knots and textures in the wood. After that, I used a maroon marker to add the next darker layer of colouring. And lastly, I used a dark bark marker, which is much darker than the previous two colours, but it really helps to add the darker shading to the lower part of the branch and to add some darker shading to the area where the dragon is sitting. And to define the textures and the knots in the wood, I used a black and white Prismacolor pencil to add lots of little shadows and highlights. For the colouring of the holly leaves, I used an ocean green marker and then used some Prismacolor pencils over the top of that to add the rest of the details. For the holly berries, I used a crimson and a cardinal marker, and then to add a highlight to the leaves and the berries, I used my Uni-Ball highlighter pen again. For the final part of this drawing, I wanted to add some colour to the sky and the clouds in the background. So I started by adding the first layer with a pale heath marker, and used an ice blue marker to add the outline of the first layer of clouds. For the next layer down, I added a darker colour, that being pale grape, and then blended upwards into the pale heath marker. And then for the next layer of clouds further down from that, I used a light grape marker, blended upwards into the pale grape marker, and then upwards further into the pale heath marker again. So the layers of clouds kind of get a little bit darker as they move down the page. And as a final touch to this drawing, I used my Uni-Ball highlighter pen to add an outline going around the dragon, and to add lots of snow in the background. And that was the drawing completed. Overall, it took about 4 hours to complete, and I really enjoyed working on this one. It's always fun to work on a drawing of a dragon. Be sure to let me know what you think of this drawing in the comments below, and if you have any suggestions for future fantasy art or fan art videos, then please let me know as well. I read through your suggestions every week, and they always help me out so much. If you enjoy videos like this, then make sure you're subscribed, and any likes, shares, that kind of support is hugely appreciated. It really means a lot to me. If you want to follow along my progress photos and keep up to date with everything I'm working on, then be sure to check out the links in the description box below to check out my Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Once again, thank you so much for the support on this channel. It means so much to me, and I absolutely love working on these videos. I really hope you enjoyed watching this one. Thank you for watching. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you all soon.